4 Times People Learned Not to Fuck with His Territory by AuncleLore. Voiced by Angsteater to assist reading. The fic is linked in the description to follow along. Summary. Dragons can get incredibly territorial. Izuku just so happens to be incredibly territorial. Or 4 times someone triggered Izuku's territorial dragon instincts. Chapter 1. Childhood Bedroom. The first time Izuku felt the urge to protect his den came at a complete surprise for both him and his mother. A few weeks ago, Izuku's quirk had manifested, ending with him claiming Kacchan as his. Mama had called to Dad the next morning, and the three of them had talked about how Izuku would experience growth and change during this time, and that if anything hurt, he needed to tell them right away. Mama also told him all about the different instincts he may experience, and that when he did experience them, to tell Mama right away. Izuku had agreed before telling Mama about the possessive feeling he had over Kacchan. Mama had nodded and giggled, explaining that this was likely his hoarding instincts, and that he should tell Kacchan about what was happening, and he should listen to Kacchan, in case he didn't want Izuku to hoard him. Izuku had bristled at that, young face pulling into a snarl because Kacchan was his. Mama had run a hand through his hair, calmly telling him that yes, Kacchan was his. But Kacchan might not want Izuku to protect him, and to just tell Kacchan about the instinct. Izuku had agreed after that. The conversation with Kacchan went about as well as Izuku expected. Kacchan was excited that Izuku had a strong quirk, and they could be heroes together, just like they always planned, and completely ignored Izuku telling him about being part of Izuku's horde. Kacchan had excitedly poked at Izuku's scales and demanded that Izuku open his mouth so he could see his teeth, and just about exploded, literally, when he saw the sharp teeth. All this to say, Izuku was beginning to experience more and more dragon-like emotions and instincts as the time continued to pass. The next time he experienced one of these instincts was on a normal Saturday morning. Izuku was bundled up in bed, curled comfortably around his favorite All Might plushie, with a warm heating pad draped across his back, which had been aching all week, lightly snoozing. He was buried under 3 or 4 fuzzy blankets that he had picked out when Mama had taken him shopping. He nestled deeper in his bed, intending on falling back asleep since it was still early when the sound of approaching footsteps at his door had him sitting up, a snarl tearing from his throat. Now Izuku knew that Saturdays were laundry days. He knew his mama would come into his room to retrieve his dirty clothes, and would return clean, folding clothes later in the day for him to put away. He knew all of this. It was routine. But someone was in his den. His sleep-blurry eyes focused on the figure in the doorway, feeling the low growl rippling through his chest and through his bared teeth. Logically, he knew this was Mama. She was just here for laundry. But this was his den. "Izu, baby," Mama called gently, not moving from the doorway, her hands lifted. Izuku just growled at her, a small puff of smoke escaping him. Mama stood there for a moment, seemingly at a loss of what to do. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked, taking a step backward. His growling lowered in intensity as he squeezed his All Might plushie closer. "Okay, baby," Mama said. "Just put your hamper outside the room when you're ready." She stepped all the way out of the room, closed the door behind her. With the door shut, Izuku felt himself settle. He blinked away the haze of sleep before he was immediately overcome with a wave of guilt. That was his mama he had just threatened. But she was in his den. But it was still his mama. Izuku slunk from the bed, grabbing his hamper by the handle and dragging it to the door. He creaked the door open and shoved the hamper out before quickly shutting the door. Izuku had a lot to consider. Chapter 2. Dorm room. No, it's my den. "Let's have a room contest," Mina said excitedly, leaning over the back of the couch. Izuku frowned, bristling at the mere concept of someone going into his den without his permission. Moving into the dorms was hard enough. He had to leave behind the home he had known and move into a place he had never seen before. Aizawa-sensei was kind enough to let him into the dorms a few times during the break, so he could get a lay of the land and select whichever dorm room he liked best. Mom had warned Aizawa-sensei about his territorialism, and had suggested Izuku be allowed to choose a room to avoid any incidents. Izuku had begrudgingly selected a room and had spent the rest of his break carefully packing his hoard of hero merch and books up, ensuring each item was thoroughly wrapped and boxed away to ensure nothing would be damaged. His mom had offered to help, but was quickly shot down. She might be his mom, but this was his hoard. He barely let Kachan touch his hoard after all. He distinctly remembers the time someone had stolen one of his notebooks back in middle school, as well as his violent reaction to that. Izuku had gotten better control of his reactions, but there were still times that they got the best of him. So he was definitely not excited for the prospect of people coming into his den. But this was also his class, and would be an opportunity for everyone to bond. He should agree to this, and he was going to, as long as he laid down some ground rules. Izuku let the shouts of agreements from his classmates settle before he cleared his throat to speak. "I'm okay with it, as long as no one crosses the entryway to my room," Izuku said seriously. "For your own safety," he added after a moment. "No problem, Mita bro." Kirishima grinned at him, all sharp teeth and bright-eyed earnestness. The rest of the class was quick to agree before they were following Mina and Kaminari through the dorms, peering into each of their classmates' rooms with critical eyes. Izuku kept to Uraka's side during the exploration, taking comfort in how she pressed herself up against him. She was one of his, after all. It kept Izuku grounded. The closer they got to Izuku's room, the more antsy he got. When they finally did arrive at his room, Izuku parted from Uraka to unlock the door. "Remember," he warned, hand on the handle. "Do not cross the threshold. It will not end well for you." He looked at the group of people surrounding the door. Once he was sure everyone had acknowledged him, he pushed the door to his den open. His light was currently off, so he stepped in, patting around the room and turning on various lamps throughout the room. Izuku had discovered that he loathed overhead lights. They were far too bright for his eyes, especially in the room he slept in. He could handle the overhead lights in the other rooms, but he preferred to keep his room dim. Once the lamps were on, he stepped closer to the bed, sweeping an arm out to his room. "I know there's a lot of stuff," he said, "but I couldn't part with my hoard." And it was true. His den was packed with his hoard. All Might posters on the walls, All Might-themed sheets on the bed, shelves packed with carefully cared for hero merch, and of course his prized books, all carefully organized. If Izuku had to name his style, the word maximalism came to mind. Aside from the merch and the books, Izuku had several blankets of various thicknesses and textures piled on his bed, and a few space heaters tucked into the corners of his room. "Whoa!" Mina said, leaning forward. "You have a lot of stuff, Midoriya." "Look at all the All Might collectibles," Hagakure added, the sleeves of her shirt moving in a way to suggest she was waving her hands around excitedly. Izuku watched Mina carefully as she leaned closer, leaning on Kaminari. They were incredibly close to crossing the threshold, and he was definitely not happy about it, if the low growl rumbling in his chest was anything to go by. "You must really like All Might, huh?" Kaminari added, taking a step forward to support Mina's weight on his back. Izuku eyed his foot, dangerously close to breaching the boundary. "It's my hoard," he reminded lowly, each word dark and grating. "Guys, be careful," Uraka said, eyes darting between Midoriya and the duo. Neither Kaminari or Mina seemed to notice. Mina gasped suddenly, pointing to a small poster on the wall. "Whoa, is that Aizawa-sensei?" she asked, bouncing up and down. "Hey, you might wanna..." Kirishima tried, moving a step forward, but was stopped when Uraka put a hand on his arm, shaking her head minutely. "No way! I didn't know he had merch," Kaminari said, shifting forward some as Mina's bouncing jostled him. Izuku reacted before anyone else could realize that Kaminari had stepped through the threshold and into his room. He shot forward, smoke billowing from his mouth, a roar tearing from his throat, every inch of him screaming, "Defend, defend, defend!" Mina shrieked, reeling backward away from Izuku, who was now right up in her face. Wings flared and teeth bared. Kaminari yelped, stumbling backward. Good, they were out of his den, but that wasn't good enough for Izuku. They needed to leave. Izuku grabbed Kaminari by the arm as he surged past them. using his leverage on the electricity user to bodily throw him down the hallway. "Whoa, Mito, chill!" Mina tried, but was quickly cut off when his head snapped around to her. Whatever was in his eyes must have been enough for her to get the message, and she darted past Izuku to Kaminari's side, helping him to his feet and both looking bewildered. "Get away!" Izuku hissed, lowering himself into a defensive stance. "Run!" Mina and Kaminari shared a look before bolting for the stairs. Izuku resisted the urge to chase, hunt, catch, and instead watched them go. Once the door to the stairs slammed shut behind them, Izuku straightened up, his wings folding in. "Izuku, you okay?" Uraka asked softly as he turned around. "I warned them," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm kind of territorial." Kirishima laughed at that, waving a hand. "They'll be fine," he said. Uraka smiled, holding an arm out for Izuku, and he tucked himself back against her side, tail coming up to pull his door closed. "Don't worry, Izuku," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You gave them ample warning. It's not your fault they didn't listen." Izuku hummed in agreement, letting himself be led along with the rest of the room tours. In the end, Sato's room was declared the winner because of his baked goods, and the class learned a valuable lesson. Don't go into Izuku's room without his explicit permission. He would chase you off of the floor entirely. Chapter 3. Don't touch Izuku's food. The next time Izuku's territorial nature reared its head had nothing to do with his den. See, dragons are territorial about many things, their den being the primary area where territorial instincts will flare dangerously. But they were also territorial about their horde, their people, and most importantly, for this incident, their food. Izuku was notorious for making large portions of food. It was something all of 1A appreciated because Izuku tended to make enough food to feed everyone with leftovers he could eat later. He was defensive of the kitchen while he was cooking naturally, but he did allow Kachan and Sato and Uraka to help him cook. They had the skills, after all. Kaminari was outright banned from the kitchen when he shorted out the coffee maker and the toaster all in one fell swoop. As was Mina when she tried to microwave her acid and the microwave exploded. Ida was only allowed to work in the kitchen with supervision. He had grown up privileged, and barely knew how to work a potato peeler. But he was willing to learn, so Izuku made sure someone who knew how to work the kitchen was supervising him. Never Kachan, though. That had ended up in a screaming match and Kachan exploding Ida. Now Izuku was fairly okay with letting people eat the leftovers from his class meals. It prickled him a bit, but when he reminded himself he was feeding his people, he was generally able to settle himself down. However, there was one meal his people knew to never eat the leftovers of: katsudan. Class 1A would say he was addicted to katsudan. Izuku would say it was just his favorite meal and it reminded him of home. Izuku would make katsudan for class dinners and only make enough that there was one leftover meal. He had made katsudan the night before the kitchen incident, after a long day in heroics, and he was exhausted, and really looking forward to eating his katsudan when he got home. Izuku had classroom duty after classes were released, so he would get back to the dorms later than the others today. But that was fine. He had made quick work of making sure the classroom was cleared before making his way to the dorms. Izuku slowed down as he approached, ear twitching as noises from inside Heights Alliance reached him. Two people were shouting, one of them being his Kachan. He couldn't make out exactly what was being said through the thick walls of the dorm, but he knew Kachan's voice anywhere. Izuku broke into a jog, slamming the door open. "What's going on?" he called over the din of voices. "Good luck, shitty hair," Kachan snapped, looking over to Izuku. "I'm not saving your dumb ass." "What happened?" Izuku said, making his way over to the kitchen where Kachan and Kirishima were yelling. "Oh, hey, Mito bro," Kirishima said, almost nervously, his hands tucked behind his back. Izuku blinked slowly, looking between Kirishima and Kachan. "Kachan?" The blonde snorted. "You might as well tell him, shitty hair. He's going to find out." Kirishima shifted from foot to foot. "Bakubro, I don't think that's a good idea." Izuku shook his head as he stepped over to the fridge. Just tell me what happened, Kirishima, he said, pulling open the fridge and rooting around to find his leftovers. So, I was really hungry, and I wasn't paying attention, so I just, Kirishima said, one hand moving to rub the back of his neck. Izuku paused in his search, not seeing any trace of his leftover bento. He turned slowly towards Kirishima, pinning him in place with a blank stare. "What's behind your back, Kirishima?" Izuku said slowly, barely managing to keep the growl out of his voice. Kirishima froze before slowly bringing out an empty bento box. Izuku's bento box, which was empty of the katsudan he had been thinking about all day. Empty of his katsudan. Listen, man, Kirishima started, but quickly stopped as Izuku let out a snarl. I'd run, Kachan advised, barely concealing his laughter. Kirishima did, in fact, bolt, launching himself over the kitchen counter and sprinting for the front door. Izuku gave chase, tearing off after Kirishima with an angry shout. Kirishima vaulted over the couch, dodging around the coffee table. "I'm so sorry, man," he was calling as Izuku leaped onto the couch behind him. "I wasn't really thinking, it was only a tiny slip of the mind." "You ate my food!" Izuku snarled, leaping at Kirishima. Kirishima yelped as Izuku tackled him, his skin hardening to brace for impact as Izuku slammed him into the ground. "Mito bro, I'm so sorry, I'll replace it, I promise." Kirishima squirmed in Izuku's grip. "It was mine," Izuku hissed, tail lashing angrily. I know, I'm so sorry, bro," Kirishima said earnestly. "How can I make it up to you?" Izuku stared at him, lip curling. "I'm hungry," he said. "Yeah, okay, I'll go get you some food right now," Kirishima said quickly. "My treat." Izuku weighed that for a moment, wings shifting as he debated simply throwing Kirishima through a wall. A familiar hand landed on his shoulder and Izuku's head whipped to find Kachan's face. The blonde was still cackling, wiping his eyes. "All right, nerd," he said, grinning. "Let your ear up so we can go get you some food." Izuku thought about it for a moment longer. He enjoyed how his prey, Kirishima, squirmed under him before getting up. "Go," he said to Kirishima, moving to sit on the couch. Kirishima scampered out of the front door without a single protest. Izuku did end up with a delicious to-go container of katsudan from a restaurant down the street, and Kirishima learned a valuable lesson about checking the bento containers in the fridge before eating them. Chapter 4 Heights Alliance. Izuku was curled up on the couch under several blankets, pressed up against Todoroki's warm side. Winter had arrived and Izuku loathed the cold more than anything in the world. He was extremely grateful that Todoroki let him use him as a personal space heater most days. It warded off Izuku's innate desire to burrow into a mountain of heating pads and blankets and just sleep the cold away. Most of Class 1A was in the common room today. It was Sunday, after all. They were split off into different groups. Momo and Ida were leading a quiet study group in one corner. Bakugo and his friends were playing video games nearby. Uraka was letting Shinso borrow her notes nearby, and more. The only people who weren't down in the common room were Shoji, Jiro, and Tokoyami, but Izuku knew they probably were in Tokoyami's room listening to music or trading book recommendations. Honestly, Izuku could nap right now, especially with how Todoroki was idly scratching his scalp while he read a book. It was calm and peaceful in the common room, if you discounted the playful trash talk coming from the self-appointed Baku squad. So the conditions were ideal for a good nap. Were being the operative word. The front doors banged open, jolting Izuku from his dozing state, eyes flicking to the front door. "Ho-ho-ho!" a voice crowed from the door. "Class 1A is slacking again!" leaving the front door open. "How abysmal! Class 1B wouldn't be caught dead with the front door unlocked." The voice had Izuku almost immediately on edge. He'd met its owner a few times, and Izuku was not his biggest fan. Rounding the corner and stepping into the common room was Neto Monoma. Monoma was well known in the hero course for his abrasive personality and his major hatred of Class 1A. He seemed to think that Class 1A thought that they were better than Class 1B, that they enjoyed being in the spotlight due to the villain attacks that Class 1A had survived. Of course, this was all bullshit. Anyone could tell 1A was incredibly traumatized from their several run-ins with the League of Villains, but Monoma couldn't get the bee out of his bonnet about Class 1A and made it his mission to torment them whenever he could. "Monoma, what are you doing here?" Momo asked, standing from her chair and walking over towards him. "Why, I'm here to talk to Shinso, of course." Monoma huffed. Izuku curled a lip at that. Shinso was one of his. What did Monoma want with the purple-haired teen? Whatever it was probably was nothing good. Shinso must have been reading his mind because he barely cast a glance at Monoma before rolling his eyes. "Fuck off, Monoma." He sighed. Monoma gasped exaggeratedly, putting a hand to his chest. "How crass! I can see 1A has infected you already. But don't worry, when you switch to 1B, we'll get you cleaned up right away." Izuku growled softly at that, pushing himself into a sitting position, eyeing Monoma warily. Todoroki placed a warm hand on his shoulder, offering a small point of grounding contact. "I'm not switching, Monoma," Shinso said, looking over to Izuku. "I suggest you leave now before things get uncomfortable for you." "Uncomfortable?" Monoma turned his gray eyes towards where Izuku was growling softly. "Oh, you mean because of your pet beast?" "Oi! Who the fuck you think you're calling a beast?" Kacchan snapped from his position on the couch beside Kirishima. "You better watch your damn mouth." Izuku huffed, watching Monoma's feet carefully. So far, he hadn't fully entered the common room, standing in the archway that separated the Ginken and the common room. He wasn't sure when he had consciously extended his den to the entire dorm building, but he had. And right now there was an unwelcome presence in the Ginken that, if he crossed into the common room, he would have to remove him. "Everyone knows that he's barely tamed." Monoma rolled his eyes, carelessly sauntering towards Shinso. "Come on, Shinso. You'd love it in Class 1B so much better. You wouldn't have to deal with all these Neanderthals. We're far more refined in 1B. Izuku snarled as Monoma approached one of his. "I suggest you leave," he warned Monoma. "Or what?" Monoma laughed, putting a hand on Shinso's shoulders. Izuku lurched toward his feet, wings flaring slightly. "This," he growled, "is your last warning." "Get your hand off of me," Shinso added, shrugging Monoma's hand off. "Monoma, I do recommend that you leave this instant," Ida added from his position with his small study group. Monoma threw his hands up. "Listen to this! Class 1A being so rude to a guest. You're so uncivilized. Really, Shinso, you want to stay here?" Izuku moved before anyone could stop him. He had done everything he was supposed to do. Everything Aizawa-sensei had been helping him with when it came to his protective instincts. He tried to give Monoma a chance to leave. He had tried to warn him away with words. But all that had failed, and now Izuku could give in to his instincts to remove the threat to his den, to his horde, to his people. Monoma yelped as Izuku surged toward him. Izuku went low, his hands wrapping around Monoma's calves. In one smooth motion, Izuku lifted Monoma, and the blonde fell. Monoma coughed as his back slammed into the floor, his eyes blowing wide in surprise. Izuku kept moving, leaping over Monoma's prone form, spinning around to grab the back of Monoma's shirt collar. "Hey!" Monoma protested, flailing in Izuku's grip. "Let me go!" "We warned you, you fucking moron!" Kacchan called from the couch. "Seriously, you're just gonna let this happen?" Monoma shrieked indignantly as Izuku dragged the blonde towards the door by the collar of his shirt. "Yeah, this is pretty normal." "Yep." Several voices called from the common room. Izuku said nothing, a low growl rumbling through his chest as he ripped the front door open again. Using his grip on Monoma's collar, he bodily threw the other teen down the steps, watching as he tumbled into the snow. "Stay the fuck away from my dorm," Izuku snarled at Monoma's prone form. "Don't you ever insult my people again." He didn't even wait for Monoma to respond, slamming the door shut. Soft hands wrapped around Izuku's forearm, and Izuku turned to see Uraka grinning at him. "You sure showed that idiot," she giggled, leading Izuku back into the common room. "We all tried to warn him," Kachan added. "I got it all on video," Kaminari added, waving his phone eagerly. Izuku blinked, looking at his classmates. Warmth bloomed in his chest. Something soft and gentle, and vastly different from the normal possessive heat. These people were his family. They weren't afraid of him, weren't put off by his instincts. They simply accepted him for who he was and took what came in stride. Yeah, family is a good word for it. The end. Be sure to support AuncleLore, link in the description. First time I've ever voiced Monoma, I kind of just gave him a really annoying announcer voice, in my opinion. I love how most of these, the territory was like a space, his living quarters, and sometimes people that he hoarded, that Izuku hoards. But then it also extends to food, but not any food. Katsudan. He only hoards Katsudan. That's adorable. Assuming that you probably found this fic on YouTube only, and you haven't seen the AO3 tags, I'd just like to point out that this tag says, Izuku calls his room Den. It's a dragon thing, babes. Don't make it weird.